This is the story of Harold Emmett Calloway and his wife Patricia Ann Calloway. They'd been married for 31 years before their daughter brought Derek home. And in those 3 decades, Harold had learned that the quietest rooms in a marriage are often the most consequential ones. Patricia had always believed that Harold's gentleness was a kind of limitation, that a man who rarely raised his voice must not feel things deeply enough, and this misreading of him had shaped the architecture of their family in ways none of them fully understood. When their daughter Lydia married Derek Harmon, Patricia saw in the young man a confidence she had always wished her husband possessed, and she opened doors for him that were never hers alone to open. What unraveled over the following 2 years was not a sudden collapse, but a slow settling. The way an old house shifts almost imperceptibly until one morning, a door no longer closes flush. Harold woke at 5:15 most mornings, as he had for the better part of 2 decades. Not because he needed to, strictly speaking, but because the hour before Patricia stirred was the only time the house felt entirely his. He would make coffee in the dark kitchen, stand at the window above the sink, and watch the yard come slowly into shape as dawn arrived. The oak tree. The stone bird bath his mother had left them. The fence line that needed repainting and kept not getting done. He was 63 years old. He had founded Calloway Integrated Solutions at 31, grown it from a regional logistics consulting firm into something with 412 employees, offices in 7 cities, and a board that met quarterly in a room with a view of the river. None of this was visible on him. He drove a 7-year-old Volvo. He wore New Balance sneakers on weekends. When he picked up the check at dinner, which he always did, he did it without ceremony. The way you'd pick up something someone had dropped on the sidewalk. Patricia came downstairs at 7, already dressed, already purposeful. That was her nature. She moved through a day the way certain people move through a crowd, with the settled assumption that space would be made. "Derek and Lydia are coming Saturday," she said, pouring her coffee without looking at him. "I told Lydia we'd do the whole thing. Lunch, the afternoon." "Good," Harold said. "He's been doing well. Derek, at the firm." She said it with a particular quality in her voice, the one she used when she wanted him to confirm something she'd already decided. Harold had placed Derek at Calloway 8 months ago, introduced through channels that obscured Harold's involvement as a regional operations coordinator. Patricia had been instrumental in suggesting it had, in fact, pressed Harold in a way that left little room. "He's family now. We hope family." Harold had agreed, as he often agreed. Not from weakness, but from the calculation that the cost of arguing was higher than the cost of compliance, at least in the short term. What Harold had not told Patricia, had not told anyone outside of his executive team and legal counsel, was that he was watching Derek with the same quiet attention he brought to any new variable in a system he cared about. The reports had started arriving 6 weeks in, not formal reports, observations. His VP of operations, a methodical woman named Sandra Cho, had mentioned in passing that the new coordinator had a particular way with the floor staff. "He makes people feel small without ever saying anything you could quote," she'd said. Harold had written nothing down. He simply held it. Saturday came mild and overcast. Lydia arrived first, carrying a ceramic dish and kissing Harold's cheek with the genuine warmth she'd carried since childhood. She had her mother's precision and his patience, which was a combination Harold found quietly beautiful. Derek came in behind her, his handshake firm in the way that is meant to communicate something. Harold, a single nod. Familiar without being warm. They ate on the back porch. Derek talked at length about restructuring the delivery scheduling protocol, using language that was technically accurate but slightly too assured, the language of a man who has learned the vocabulary of expertise without yet having earned its instincts. Patricia listened with visible satisfaction. Lydia ate quietly, refilling water glasses when they got low. At one point, while Patricia was inside fetching the dessert plates, Derek's phone buzzed and he glanced at it, then said to no one in particular, "Mercer's going to be a problem. Keeps pushing back on the route consolidations. Guy's been there 20 years and thinks that means something." Harold looked at him. "Doesn't it?" Derek smiled in the way people smile when they're being patient. "Tenure isn't the same as value, Harold." Harold said nothing. He watched a sparrow land on the edge of the bird bath, consider something, and fly away. That was the moment. Not loud, not even noticeable, probably, to anyone watching, but Harold felt it a small, precise click, like a tumbler falling into place inside a lock. The Mercer situation resolved itself within 3 weeks. Resolved was Derek's word, delivered to Patricia over Sunday dinner with the satisfaction of a man reporting a successful outcome. What it meant, Harold learned from Sandra the following Tuesday, was that Raymond Mercer, 22 years with the company, the institutional memory of the entire Midwest routing operation, had been managed out. Not fired, managed. His hours had been restructured, his direct reports quietly reassigned, his input in team meetings systematically deferred until the man had understood, as people eventually understand these things, that the environment had become hostile to his continued presence. He had submitted his resignation on a Thursday. Derek had taken the team to lunch on Friday. He didn't do anything technically wrong, Sandra said. She was choosing her words carefully, as she always did with Harold. There's nothing in writing. There never is, Harold said. He sat with it. This was his method, not to react, but to sit with information the way you'd sit with a piece of music you didn't yet understand, letting it reveal itself in its own time. He had been sitting with Derek Harmon for months now, and what was revealing itself was a specific kind of person, intelligent, genuinely so, but operating from a model of the world in which power over others was itself the goal, not merely a byproduct of legitimate achievement. At home, Patricia had begun speaking about Derek with a frequency that Harold recognized. It was the same frequency she had used years ago when Lydia first brought home a boyfriend Patricia disapproved of, but inverted. This was the approving version. Derek's name entered conversations where it had no natural business being. Derek thinks the downtown office should expand. Derek was saying the industry is shifting. Derek has a real instinct for this sort of thing. Harold listened. He was good at listening. Patricia sometimes mistook his listening for agreement. "You should talk to him more," she said one evening, not looking up from her book. "One-on-one. He respects you, Harold. He just doesn't know how to show it." Harold considered this. "What does that look like in your reading of it?" She did glance up then, briefly. "What do you mean? How does someone respect you without being able to show it? What are the signs?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression he recognized, not quite irritation, something more like reorientation, the way you recalibrate when a room isn't quite the shape you'd assumed. "You know what I mean," she said and returned to her book. Harold did know what she meant, he simply wasn't sure she did. He had been doing something he rarely did during this period, writing things down, not at the office, where everything was already documented through proper channels, but at home in a narrow notebook he kept in the drawer of his bedside table. Not a journal, Harold had never kept a journal. More like notations. Dates, names, a phrase here and there. Mercer. Root consolidations. Tenure isn't the same as value. It was the instinct of an engineer, maybe, or simply of someone who has learned that memory is more wishful than accurate, and that facts are patient things. Lydia called him on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. She usually called on weekends. "Dad." A pause. "How are you?" It was not quite a question. Harold heard the shape of it and adjusted accordingly. "I'm all right. You?" "I'm fine." Another pause, and in it Harold heard something being decided against. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "That's enough reason," he said. She laughed a brief, soft sound, and he heard in it something tired underneath. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing particular. Her garden, a documentary she'd watched, a restaurant she and Derek had gone to. She said Derek's name twice, both times with a precise neutral quality like someone reading from a list. When they hung up, Harold sat for a moment in his car in the driveway, his hands resting on the wheel. He was not the kind of man who was easily frightened, that certain things moved through him like weather, slow and total, and what moved through him now was the recognition that his daughter was managing something she had not yet named, even to herself. He looked at the house, The lights in the kitchen were on. Patricia was making dinner. He thought, in a rare and somewhat uncomfortable way, that the story of what was happening might be longer and more costly than he had calculated. He had been operating with patience, which was usually his most reliable instrument. But patience, he understood, can be a form of permission if you're not careful about what you're being patient with. He opened the car door. He went inside. That night in bed, Patricia reading beside him, he looked at the ceiling and thought about Raymond Mercer, who had given 22 years of himself to a company he didn't know Harold owned, and who had been made to feel unwanted by a man who had been there 8 months. He thought about Lydia's voice on the phone, the precise neutrality of it. He thought, I've let this go on long enough. Then, because he was Harold, he also thought, a little longer. Let it complete itself. He turned off his lamp. Patricia kept reading for another half hour, her light a warm stripe on the ceiling. He lay in its edge and listened to her turn pages and did not sleep for a long time. He thought, somewhere in the quiet of it, in a way that felt almost involuntary, the way a person talks to themselves in an empty room. I don't know how to explain this part. Maybe just stay with it, like this story, or, and then he stopped, because the thought had arrived from somewhere strange, a different register entirely, and he felt the oddness of it, like a word you suddenly can't remember how to spell. He let it pass. He returned to the ceiling, to the stripe of warm light, to the sound of pages. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday of November. Harold had been planning his approach since September, which was perhaps longer than necessary, but Harold did not believe in improvisation when the stakes involved people he was responsible for. He told Patricia the week before that there was a significant board session coming. She nodded the way she nodded at his professional life generally acknowledgement without particular interest. His work had always existed at a comfortable remove from their shared domestic world, partly by design and partly by accumulated habit. Patricia knew Harold was a consultant, broadly speaking. She knew he did well. She had never asked questions that would have required more detailed answers, and Harold had never volunteered them. He had not hidden his ownership of Callaway out of deception, exactly. It was more that the identity had settled around him over the years, like a well-fitting garment invisible, when it fit well. He was Harold to the people who mattered to him. What he owned had always seemed like a separate question. The week before the board meeting, Derek came into the main office for a presentation to the regional leads. Harold was present, as he sometimes was, seated near the back, introduced to newcomers simply as Harold, which was accurate. Derek saw him, nodded with the familiarity of a son-in-law tolerating the presence of a mild elder, and proceeded to give his presentation. It was good, technically. Derek was not incompetent. Harold had never thought he was. The problem was a different one. It lived in the texture of the presentation, the casual dismissal of concerns raised by the distribution team, the way Derek spoke about efficiency in language that subtracted people from the equation. The moment near the end when someone asked about the Mercer transition and Derek said smoothly, Raymond found a better fit elsewhere and moved on before anyone could respond. Sandra caught Harold's eye from across the room. He gave the smallest possible nod. 3 days before the board meeting, Harold asked Patricia if they could talk. A real conversation, he said. Not over a meal, just talk. She looked at him with mild surprise. He did not usually qualify conversations this way, and said of course. And they sat in the living room with the television off, which already made it feel different from their usual evenings. Harold said, I want to tell you something about work. Patricia arranged herself more attentively. Callaway isn't a firm I consult for, he said. I founded it. I own it. I've owned it for 32 years. The silence that followed was a particular kind. Not shocked, exactly. More like a recalibration occurring in real time. She stopped. Why are you telling me this now? Because Derek works there. She sat with that for a moment. He watched her face move through several things without settling. How is that? She stopped again. He doesn't know. No one outside of legal and my exec team knows. I've kept it that way deliberately for 32 years. Her voice had gone quiet in a way that was not quite hurt and not quite anger. Yes, That's Harold. She looked at her hands, then at the window. Why didn't you tell me? I told you I did well. I told you we were fine. You never asked further. It was not an accusation. He said it the way a person states a fact that contains complexity without needing to dramatize it. She heard this, he could tell, because her first instinct to object subsided before it reached the surface. Derek, she said, and the word sat strangely in the room. I've been watching how he operates, Harold said, for several months, and what I've seen is a pattern I can't ignore. He was careful here. He did not perform outrage. He described specifically and quietly what Sandra had reported, what he had observed, what the documentation showed. Raymond Mercer's departure, 2 other employees in the Midwest region who had resigned, a pattern of small, cumulative pressures applied to people who questioned Derek's methods. Patricia was quiet for a long time. He's ambitious, she said finally. Some of it is just that's how the industry works, Harold. Parts of it are, he said, not all of it. Are you going to… She stopped. Started differently. What happens Thursday? The board will see the documentation, decisions will follow from that. And Lydia. He paused. This was the part that cost him something. Lydia will need to understand what kind of man she's married. I can't protect her from that by protecting him. Patricia's eyes had gone somewhere else interior, somewhere he couldn't follow. He watched her sit with the information, and what he saw was not a woman defending Derek. What he saw was a woman realizing the weight of what her enthusiasm had cost. She had opened doors for Derek. She had spoken of him to Harold without approving frequency. She had, in her own way, vouched for a man she had not examined carefully enough. I should have asked you more, she said quietly. It wasn't directed at him precisely. It was more like she was updating an internal record. Harold said, You couldn't have known. No, she said, but I didn't try. They sat in the living room for a long time after that, not saying much. The house settled around them, its familiar sounds. At some point, Patricia went to make tea and brought him a cup without asking if he wanted one. He drank it. Outside, the night was clear and cold. The board meeting lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Harold presented the documentation himself, which surprised the board less than it might have they had, most of them. Worked with Harold long enough to understand that his patience in arriving at a conclusion was matched only by his thoroughness once he had. Derek's contract was terminated effective immediately. Sandra coordinated the process with the quiet efficiency that made Harold trust her. Derek was walked out that afternoon by HR, carrying a box that seemed to surprise him by how light it was. Harold was not present for that part. He was in his office, on the phone with his general counsel, discussing the settlement terms and the non-disclosure parameters. He stayed late. He drove home in the dark. The weeks that followed were the kind that resist easy narration. Lydia did not speak to Harold for 11 days. When she did call, she was controlled in the way people are controlled when they are trying to be fair to contradictory feelings simultaneously. She did not defend Derek fully. She did not condemn Harold fully. She said things like, I understand why you did it, and I just wish I had known sooner, and Harold accepted these as honest because they were. Derek had tried, briefly, to characterize his termination to mutual acquaintances as a restructuring casualty to company going in a different direction. This held for about 2 weeks before enough people knew enough that it stopped being useful. Harold did not correct the record publicly. He did not need to. Patricia moved through these weeks in a way that was subtly different from how she had moved through things before. She was still purposeful, still precise. But something had gone quieter in her. The frequency with which she had spoken Derek's name dropped to 0 without acknowledgement. When Lydia called, Patricia listened more than she talked, which was new. One evening she said to Harold, I made it easier for him by being so sure of him. You wanted good things for Lydia, he said. That's not the same as looking clearly at who someone is. She paused. You saw it. I was watching from a different position. You were watching, she said. I wasn't. He didn't press it. That was not his way. But the conversation sat with him afterward because there was something in it he recognized. Patricia was not rebuilding a story in which she had been right. She was sitting inside the version in which she had been wrong, and this, Harold understood, cost her something real. He had expected her to find some framework that preserved her judgment. He would not have blamed her for it. People do this, it is nearly universal, and she had not. And this made him think differently about her in ways that were not simple. Lydia began couples counseling in January. She mentioned it to Harold factually, without particular editorial. He said he thought that took courage. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't know if I'm staying, Dad." He said, "That's yours to know in your own time." She said she knew. They talked about other things. Harold returned to his routines. 5:15 mornings, the kitchen window, the bird bath, the fence that needed painting. He found himself thinking about Raymond Mercer, who had given 22 years and then spent a Thursday cleaning out a desk. He had his assistant locate Mercer's current information and drafted a letter, himself not an apology exactly, because the situation had not been Harold's failure, but an acknowledgement. He offered Mercer a senior advisory position, project-based while compensated. Mercer called 2 days later, and the conversation was careful on both sides, and they arrived at an arrangement that worked. It did not undo anything. Harold did not believe in redemptive arithmetic that good acts cancel harm already done. But it was the right thing. And doing the right thing had its own logic, separate from outcomes. In March, Patricia asked him if he wanted to go away for a week somewhere. Just them. He said yes. They went to a place in Vermont they had been to early in their marriage, before children, before the company had grown large enough to require him continuously. The inn had changed. Some of the surrounding land had been sold off. But the light in the evenings was the same. They walked a lot. They did not talk constantly, which had always been something he appreciated about their best periods together. The comfort of shared silence. One afternoon, sitting by a frozen pond, Patricia said, "I think I made you smaller in my head than you were, for a long time." He looked at the ice. "I wasn't performing smallness," he said. "I just never thought it needed performing." "I know," she said. "I think that's the part I got wrong." Lydia filed for divorce in April. She called Harold on a Sunday to tell him, using the measured, clear voice she had been using since January, a voice that sounded like someone who had done a great deal of interior work to arrive at this clarity. She did not sound broken. She sounded like a person who had made a decision they had tested from every angle and found to be the right one. "Okay," Harold said. "That's all you're going to say. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it came to this." "Don't be sorry," she said. "I'm not." A pause. "Well, I'm something, but not sorry. What are you?" She considered this seriously, the way she had always considered things seriously since she was a child. "Clear," she said finally. "I think I'm clear." Harold held that for a moment. "That's worth something." "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." They talked for another 20 minutes. When they hung up, Harold sat in his study and looked at the window. The yard was beginning to come back to itself. Early green at the edges of things, the oak tree budding. The bird bath needed cleaning. He took the notebook from his desk drawer. He looked at the early entries. Mercer. Root consolidations. He looked at the later ones, which were sparser. He closed the notebook. He did not throw it away, but he moved it to the back of the drawer, where things go when they are no longer needed immediately, but may still matter someday. Derek had left the city. Harold had heard this through peripheral channels and had not sought more detail. He found he had no strong feeling about it, not satisfaction, not pity, something more neutral and complete, like the end of weather. A Sunday in late April, Harold and Patricia had Lydia over for dinner. Just the three of them, a configuration the house hadn't held in a while, and which settled around them with a particular quietness. Lydia seemed lighter than she had in over a year, not happy in a simple way, but present in a way she hadn't been. She ate 2 servings of Patricia's roasted chicken. She told a long story about a problem at her job that had resolved absurdly, and laughed at the end of it in a way that seemed to surprise even her. After dinner, Lydia and Patricia did the dishes together, talking at low volume, and Harold sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and watched them. He was aware of this scene in the way you are aware of something that might not last, and that you should not try to hold too tightly aware of the overhead light, the sound of water. The two of them passing things back and forth with the practiced ease of a long familiarity that had its own kind of warmth. He thought about the 32 years, not regretfully, more like someone taking stock. He had built something quietly without requiring anyone to see it. He had watched and waited and documented and acted when it was time to act. He had not done it cleanly. Some people had been harmed in the time he was watching, and that was a real cost, and he carried it. He had not told his wife the shape of his own life for reasons that made sense to him, and that had also, he understood now, created a distance he hadn't fully measured. These things coexisted. That was the nature of things. Lydia dried her hands and came to sit beside him at the table. Patricia put on the kettle. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was dark, the bird bath a pale shape at the edge of the light. "Are you okay, Dad?" He looked at his daughter, her face, which had her mother's precision and something else that was entirely her own something, careful and searching, that he recognized as the same quality he saw when he looked in a mirror and remembered too. "Look, yeah," he said, "I'm all right." She held his gaze for a moment, the way people do when they're checking whether the answer is true. Then she nodded, because it was, and that was enough. Patricia brought the tea. They sat together at the table, the three of them, in the kitchen, in the house Harold had owned for 28 years. The windows dark and the room warm, and the evening moved on in the way evenings do, without announcement, until it was late enough to be the beginning of something else. Harold drove home from nowhere. He was already home. He washed his cup. He turned off the kitchen light. He went upstairs. The oak tree would bud and leaf and drop its leaves again. The bird bath would fill with rain. The fence would continue to need painting. And eventually, one Saturday in May, Harold would paint it himself, unhurried, with a radio on the porch railing and the morning around him. It would take most of the day. Patricia would bring him lunch and sit on the steps while he ate it. Neither of them would remark on the fence. They had by then other things to not remark on, which is its own kind of intimacy, the kind that survives.